So, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما اللهم افتح علينا حكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام وصل اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الكرام ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم الحمد لله. So this section that we stopped at last night was the section on singing and music, and so inshallah we'll look at a little bit more detail on that because it's an important section. It's obviously a problem, and it's always a topic of a lot of debate and discussion amongst Muslims. So he says, كَذَا غِنَاءٌ لِحَرَامٍ دَاعِي وَغَيْرُهُ يُكْرَهُ كَالسَّمَاعِ. The ghina in Arabic means generally singing, but because the word musiqa is from a Greek term, museke, the Arabs took musiqa from the Greek. So the Arabs generally, ghina can mean music. They also use the word tarab for something that excites you. One of the words for the musician is mutrib, or the singer is a mutrib. So we get in the English language and out of the French, troubadour is probably from that derivation. So he's basically saying that if it's something that calls to the haram, then it's like that, and other than that, it's makruh. And then he says kasama'i. Sama', if people noticed last night at the dinner when the waiters walked by and they were all talking amongst each other, Sri Abdul Fattah said, he stopped singing and said, Sama'. He was basically letting them know this is called sama', because sama' means to listen or audition. A-U-D-I-T-A. And so sama' is a tradition that arose out of the Islamic spiritual tradition, which was where people would sing qasa'id. Now the Prophet ﷺ undeniably, and nobody could deny this, had people amongst him who did sing, and Anjasha was one of them, Amr ibn al-Akwa was another. In the Sahih of Imam Muslim, he's there, he sang for the Sahaba in front of the Prophet ﷺ. We know the two jariyas that were singing, some young girls were singing on the Eid day, and Abu Bakr came in. We know in Tirmidhi and Ahmad and Bayhaqi and others, the black woman who swore an oath that if the Prophet returned safely, she would bang her drum and sing. Adribu ad-duf wa ataghanna. And the Prophet ﷺ said, if you made that, idha nadarti, right? So if you made that nadar, if you made that vow, then fulfill it. And she began to bang her drum over the Prophet ﷺ's head, and he allowed that. And then in one riwayah, Abu Bakr came in and she kept playing her drum and singing. Then the next one, Ali came in, and then Uthman came in. And then when Umar came in, she stopped, put it behind her, and then sat on her drum. And the Prophet ﷺ was amused by that and said that, even shaitan's afraid of you. And that implies, and some of the scholars took from that a negative thing, but the scholars, and that hadith is considered a mushkil hadith. It's a problematic hadith because you cannot make an oath in something that's prohibited, and you don't fulfill an oath if you made an oath to fulfill something that was haram. You don't fulfill that because it's not a vow, rather, a nadar. So the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that, and in the hadith when Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu came in, he said, mizmarun min mazamir ash-shaytan? Is this a pipe from the pipes of shaitan? And the Prophet ﷺ said, دعهما فإنه عيد. Leave them alone because it's an Eid. So, in other words, and in fact, the ulama who argue in favor of the permissibility of these things say that Abu Bakr was making a ruling over the dominant aspect of music, which is it is a mizmar from the mazamir of shaitan. And if you look out there around the world and just look at what music is used for and the people involved in music, it's pretty clear who's running the industry. Like one of Billy Joel said, if the devil had an industry, it'd be the music industry. Well, little does he know, he does have an industry, and it is the music industry. So that's just a reality. And anybody that studies the history of a lot of these things, you'll see the type of debauchery that's involved in these things. And some of the artists are some of the lowest creatures that walk the planet. I mean, really, you just have to look at their faces after a career in music to see what type of lives they've lived. I mean, I actually wanted to take a photograph of Yusuf Islam and then put it next to it, one of the Rolling Bones, just to let people see what happens when somebody takes a spiritual path and what happens when somebody doesn't, right? And it's all you have to do, proof's in the pudding. Because, like somebody once said, at 50, everybody has the face they deserve. Really. So basically that's what he's saying. Now, the sama' is a tradition that the ulama differed on, undeniably, and some of the ulama prohibited. In fact, Ibn Arabi argued that sama' by his time was no longer permissible because of all of the things associated with it. And you will see in tasawwuf, you will see every generation talks about how the tasawwuf is over and the people are gone. Imam al-Junayd was already making complaints. So this is part of the overall decline and fall of spirituality in its curvilinear. It's not really curvilinear, it's just it reached its pinnacle with the Prophet ﷺ's community, and after that the Prophet ﷺ said, لا يأتي زمان أو يوم إلا والذي بعده شر منه حتى تلقوا ربكم, which is a sound hadith that no time will come or even a day will come that is not worse than the one that preceded it until you meet your Lord. And some of the people want to limit that to the time of the Sahaba, but it's simply not true, because every generation is one generation further away from the Prophet ﷺ. So there has to be the distance. Anas radiallahu anhu said that we didn't finish burying the Prophet ﷺ until we were already feeling the naqs in our hearts, and in a riwayah, ankarna qulubana, that we were actually denying our hearts. Just his physical presence, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was so important to their spiritual well-being, so that you can see, and that's a proof of the Prophet, how quickly it fell apart. I mean, these people that he brought together that were completely dispersed. كنتم على شفا حفرة من النار. They were literally on the brink of a hellfire. And the Prophet ﷺ came, united this people that had never been united before. And within a very short period of time, they were fighting each other again. So it's not surprising. And the Prophet ﷺ, when Abu Bakr filled that vacuum that was left by his physical disappearance. When he filled that vacuum, it's like coming into the hub, that empty space that keeps the wheel, because there's no ego there. It's the egoless space. That's what keeps the thing turning. And so Abu Bakr was able to come in, and then Omar came in. By the time Uthman gets there, the torque is so great because of all these new people come into Islam, and they don't have the spiritual qualities that the earlier people had. And so Uthman is having a more and more difficult time holding it together, and then it begins to come apart. And then Ali comes in, and by that time the community is fragmented. So the Prophet ﷺ, getting back to this, the deterioration of the quality is something that has been remarked on since the beginning. And so it's not surprising that you'll find these constantly. Now, the Prophet ﷺ permitted alhan al-Arab, the tunes of the Arabs that were used. Lahan is the tune. And even the Quran was to be not sung but chanted with the alhan. It's permitted to chant the Quran, which is why we have Quran reciters that will chant. And the master Quran reciters learn the maqamat. So they actually know the maqamat. See, if you watch them, they're doing a very sophisticated rhythm. And when they speed up, they all speed up at the same time. They can stop on a dime because they're following the ozan and the maqams that they're singing. And each one of those songs that they sing, the qasaid that they sing, have maqamat that are sung. So they sing the Hijazi, or they sing the Rust, Maqam al-Rust, or Isfahani. They have all these maqams that they sing. According to legend, there were 24 maqams originally. And then some got lost. But these, we know that, and this is where music becomes a serious problem. The Pythagoreans worked out that music is related to geometry. And in classical Western tradition, you had what was called the quadrivium, and so you studied arithmetic first, which is number, discrete number, arithmetic, 1, 2, 3, 4. And obviously not simple arithmetic, but the meaning of numbers. Because numbers are related, all numbers are multiples of 1. Everything comes from 1. And then you went into geometry, which was number in space. And then you went into music, which was number in time and space. And then you went into astronomy, music, which is number in time. And then you went to astronomy, which is number in time and space. So there was a cosmology to the quadrivium. And these are related to cosmologies. Now, different maqamat affect different parts of your soul. And this is why the prohibitions of music are there, because music is very, very dangerous. And a lot of people don't know what they're doing with the music. And if you don't believe this, all you have to do is look at some documentary footage of what was called Beatlemania in the West, and how mad people went over new sounds of music that were being popularized and promoted over the airways. And rock and roll had a massive impact on people. And as it got darker and darker, and you went into these heavy metal and all these other types of, you get some really, really serious problems at these concerts where people literally will go mad. I mean, obviously there's drug involvement, and this is another reason, because you'll find many of the hadith that talk about the prohibition of music also have drugs mentioned in the same hadith. In fact, there's an argument that all of them have drugs mentioned in the same hadith. And the Prophet ﷺ said the end of time won't come until people permit. And then he said, music, basically the sex, because that's the word he used meant that. And then and drugs, intoxicants. So he actually mentioned those three together, right? Which in Western parlance is sex, drugs, and rock and roll, which became a kind of mantra of the 1960s, and we're still feeling the repercussions of that in the West since that time, which was a massive change. And Plato argued that you will never change musical modes in a society except that it will have a radical effect on the culture and nature of the society. So musical changes actually are harbingers of shifts within society. And so this is called ethos theory in the Greek tradition, that music has a powerful impact on the soul. Rumi in the Masnawi, rahimahullah, talks about the soul being really almost seduced into the body with the flute, the reed flute. And that's an indication, a mythological indication of the power that music has. And he talks about the morose sounds of the reed flute and the impact that they have on the heart. So music is very powerful, and it's really not something to be played with because people don't know what they're doing. And in traditional, like if you go into traditional like ragas in Indian music, they have a whole science, and they know that they're having an impact on people. Al-Farabi wrote a book called Kitab al-Musiq al-Kabir, and in that book he gives you the maqamat to use that where you can make people laugh. If you play the maqams, they'll start laughing uncontrollably. You can play other maqams and they'll start crying. And so this is the power that exists in this form. So what you have to understand is that the religion does not have a blanket permissibility, and it doesn't have a blanket prohibition, but it has a dialectic of tension to make sure that we don't go astray in either way. And so, for instance, what we just heard, which is sama', you can, if you're present, and if your heart's open to it, it can actually have a very powerful spiritual impact on you. I mean, they can put you into a state of hudur, of presence with your Lord. And this can happen. And obviously, the Quran does this as well for people. And I don't want to put them in the same category because they're not. إِذَا جَاءَ الْحَقِّ زَهِقَ الْبَاطِلِ. Everything other than the Quran, in terms of this, has a vacuity to it. But the meanings also are embodied in these words. The things that they're saying, you know, are very powerful things. Imam al-Busayri, they were just reciting very powerful meanings from Imam al-Busayri. So just to look at a few things, he says that the Imam Muhammad al-Hasan says, quoting Mafatih al-Kunuz, that sama' has three categories. The first is absolute prohibition, and this is for the majority of people, and this is the traditional view. I'm just giving you what the ulama have said. And these are for young people that become very affected by it, and the shahawat are ghaliba alayhim. When they have too much of their licentious nature is too strong. So the shahawat, the concupiscent soul, is very strong, and they haven't learned to control that yet. That this can actually arouse in them passions. And so for these people, it's not a good thing. And also because they haven't purified their hearts and worked on that. And so the sama' can actually have a negative effect on those people. And then the second one is mubah. And this is people that can listen to it and they just enjoy the sounds of it. And so it doesn't have a negative impact on them, but it's something that they take pleasure in. وَيَتَرَوَّحْ. They get some repose or something. And the third one is mandub, and these are the people that love Allah, and it actually encourages them to get closer to Allah, that they feel a nearness from it, and so it affects them in that way. And Sidi Ahmed Zarruq in his commentary on the Baghrisiya, and this is very interesting lafta of Sidi Ahmed Zarruq, a indication that he got out of it. He said, Amma adatul lahwi, this is in his commentary. The Baghrisiya is a famous primer that was used by the Malikis in North Africa. He was a great Algerian scholar, Abdurrahman al-Waghlisi. And his book was used for many hundreds of years as a primer, like Ibn Ashir. Ibn Ashir pretty much became the dominant text. But before that, Al-Waghrisi and the Qurtubiyya were more dominant. Anyway, it's a beautiful text, and Sidi Ahmad Zarruq did a very nice commentary on it. But he says, وَأَمَّا آلَةُ اللَّهْوِ كَالْبُوقِ وَالْغِيطَ وَالْعُودِ وَغَيْرِهَا مِنْ آلَاتِ الطَّرَبِ فَلَا يُحِلُّ سَمَعُهَا اخْتِيارًا. So, Sidi Ahmad Zarruq says, as for these instruments of diversion, lahu is diversion, anything that entertains you, diverts you. He says, like the buq, the drum, the ghita, it's like a bagpipe, and then the oud, which is a stringed instrument, and these other types of instruments that are alat al-tarab. They're means by which people are excited. فَلَا يَحِلُّ سَمَعُهَا اخْتِيارًا. It's not permissible to listen to them by choice. So if you're hearing it in a store, doesn't go under that category. But then he says, وَمَا يُذْكَرُ عَنْ إِبْنِ عُمَرْ أَنَّهُ لَمَّا اجْتَازَ بِصَحْبِ الشَّبَابَ غَلَّقَ أُذَنَيْهِ. So he passed by a man who was playing an instrument, and he closed his ears. Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, he plugged his ears. But he was with Nafi', وَلَمْ يَأْمُرْ نَافِعًا بِذَلِكَ يحتمل أن نافعا لم يؤثر عنده فلا يلزمه غلق أذنيه. So what he was saying is, what that indicates is that Nafi' was not affected negatively by these things. And so he didn't have to close his ears. Now he says, and this is Imam al-Wazani, who wrote, I think, one of the finest legal arguments that I've ever heard for the permissibility of music. He was a great scholar from Morocco. And the Moroccans tended to follow the Andalusian school because the Andalusians tended to be more lenient about this. And it's important for those of us who are in the West, in societies where music is profoundly central to the cultural heritage. Even though there's a lot of negative music, nonetheless, music is profoundly central to the cultural heritage. And so we have to be careful about making this an issue whereby people actually are alienated from Islam. So it's very important to have a nuanced understanding of this, because in certain countries in the Muslim world it's not a problem. But if you take certain types of Islam as the way you introduce people to Islam, that could have a very negative effect. And that's why triaging is very important. You have to let people see what Islam is before you start giving them all the details, many of which are not agreed upon. I mean, this is part of the problem. We've got so many people that think this is Islam and there's no other Islam. It's my Islam or no Islam. And so what he says here, Imam al-Ghazali, فَلَا يَحِلُّ سَمَعُهَا اخْتِيارًا يعني حيث كانت تؤثر فيه بأن توقعه في محرم. بدليل آخر كلامه حيث قال إن نافعا لم يؤثر فيه فلا يلزمه غلق أذنيه فهو يفيد أن عدم الحلية خاص بمن يؤثر فيه فتأمله. So what he's saying is, if you really look at the subtlety of this argument, he's saying that if it affects you negatively, right, then that's really what they're arguing, that you shouldn't be listening to this. And Nafi' was not affected by it, so he did not tell him to close his ears. So had it been haram to hear it, he would have told him to close the ears. Do you see? And so he says, this shows you that the prohibition is specific about the effect that it has on you. That's where the prohibition lies. And then he says, the great Sheikh Abdul Ghani al-Nablusi, he was a famous Sheikh, and he tended to incline towards the permissibility of sama'. So this is very different, because Imam al-Ghazali argues for this, and Abdul Ghani al-Nablusi and others. في رسالتي بعد كلامه كذلك جميع الآلات المطربة. He says all of the musical instruments are like that. إذا استعملت باللهو واللعب كانت حراما وإذا خرجت عن اللهو عند أحد زالت الحرمة. So he's saying all of these instruments, if they are used just to completely divert people from what they should be doing or something like that, then of course they fall into that category of prohibition. But it depends on what they're being used for. So, and then he says,
ومعلوم أن هذه الآلات المطربة بجميع أنواعها ليست حرمتها من حيث ذاتها وصورها المخصوصة، ولا من حيث ما يصدر عنها من الأصوات المطربة، وإلا لكان كل صوت مطربا حراما، أو كل صوت مطربا حراما، وهو باطل، لأن أصوات الطيور والشحارير المطربة ليست حراما، أو المطربة، لأن أصوات الطيور والشحارير المطربة ليست حراما إجماعا، بل حرمتها لاقتران اللهو بها ولكونها ملاهي. So he says, it's well known that all of these instruments, all these different types, their prohibition is not from the essence of these things or their forms, whatever specific form they take, but it has to be what they're used for. Because if you argued that, then you would have to say all of the musical sounds that you hear are prohibited, like the sounds of birds. And this is also Imam al-Ghazali's argument. He said you'd have to, when the birds start chirping, music, because they have maqams. You can actually, if a musician could take a bird song and put it into musical notation, because they're actually singing musical notes. And so he's saying if that's the case, then you'd have to say that all of that is haram. And he said that nobody says that. And then Abd al-Ghani al-Nabrisi also mentions that Ibn Hajar radiallahu anhu, when he was talking about the prohibition of instruments in a letter he wrote about that, he starts talking about sama' and the mazamir wasair al-malahi, and he said وَلَسْنَا نُحَرِّمُ مُطَّقَ السَّمَاعِ وَلَا نَعْتَقِدُ أَنَّ كُلَّ مَا يُفْعَلُ مِنْ ذَلِكَ فَسَفْسَافٌ وَضَيَاعٌ بل منهم العارفون وهم حزب الله ألا إن حزب الله هم الغالبون. So even Ibn Hajar is saying we don't think that all of sama' is negative. No, some of it is not a waste of time. So it's important to see that. And I think another thing, and one of the things that the ulama mention is a lot of this, like I said, is sadd al-dharaya. But part of the problem with the sadd al-dharaya is that when you say something's haram to cut off the pretext of it, the danger of that is to fall under the category of وَلَا تَقُولُوا تَصِفُوا أَلْسِنَتُكُمُ الْكَذِبَ هَذَا حَلَالٌ وَهَذَا حَرَامٌ لِتَفْتَرُوا عَلَى اللَّهِ الْكَذِبَ إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَفْتَرُونَ عَلَى اللَّهِ الْكَذِبَ لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ. You know, that the don't say with your tongues in a lying state, this is halal and this is haram, right? Because only Allah can make halal and only Allah can make haram through His Prophet ﷺ. So if something is not clearly haram in the Quran or in the Hadith, then you have to be very careful. And the later ulama took that road of declaring things halal and haram that the early community did not. And they did it from sadd al-dharaya. And that was their ijtihad. But when Imam Malik was asked about music, he said, لا يفعله إلا الفساق عندنا. The people that do that are fusaq. They're not pious people. Because it's a waste of time. You see. But he didn't say haram, la yajuz or something like that. He just said, لا يفعله إلا الفساق عندنا واللبيب بالإشارة يفهم. Because they didn't want to do that. And this is why Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in has a section on the prohibition of calling a fatwa the hukm of Allah. And this comes from a hadith in al-Bukhari where Burayda asked the Prophet ﷺ, if we come to a city, should we nunzirhum ala hukmi Allah? And he said, لا تنزلهم على حكم الله ولكن أنزلهم على حكمك. فهو أهون أن تخطئ في حكم أن تخطئ في حكمك من أن تخطئ في حكم الله. Because it's easier, or كما قال, that don't say it's that you'll take their surrender based on the judgment of Allah, but say it's your own judgment. You see, because the ijtihad is your own judgment, and you don't know whether you got Allah's ruling or not. And this is why the fatwas are attempts at getting the ruling of Allah. And that's clarified in usul and things like this. But a lot of people don't know that or understand that. So generally, and then just finally, Sidi Mawaq when the Mukhtasar of Khalil talks about listening to ghina, he says, ولما حرمت الخمر وكان ضرب الأوتاء ونفخه في المزمار يقارن شربها غالبا ويحرك النفس إلى شربها انسحب حكم التحريم على ذلك بخلاف ما لا يطرب به ولا يدعو إلى الشرب. فانظر قوله بخلاف ما لا يطرب به ولا يدعو إلى الشرب فإن هذا هو الدافع الآن. So he said that Imam al-Ma'ziri said that when the prohibition of khamr came down, of drugs and alcohol, intoxicants, the listening to the autar was related, listening to the oud and these things was related to those things. And also blowing in the pipes and the flutes and things. All of that was related to alcohol and drinking, and it encouraged people to drink. And so the hukam of tahrim went with that. And this is why, this is what Ibn Hazm argues, that if you look at the hadiths, they all have alcohol in them. And he says, بِخِلَافِ مَا لَا يُطْرَبُ بِهِ وَلَا يَدْعُو إِلَى الشُّرْبِ. So this means that the same ruling doesn't go under those things that don't call to the haram and don't call to drinking or cause that. So that's basically, anyway, I just want to cover that. So we have to understand it's a nuanced problem. The dominant position of the four madhabs is that singing is permissible, the duf drum is permissible, some of them permit the flute also, generally stringed instruments. The khilaf is weak on that, so generally the stringed instruments have been prohibited, and it relates to the effect that the stringed instruments, because the stringed instruments are actually far more powerful in terms of their effect on the soul than the percussion instruments. Piano, for instance, is really a percussion instrument, but the stringed instruments, like the oud and sitar and guitar and all these different instruments, they can be very dangerous, and people are very profoundly affected by them. So that is generally where the ulama went in terms of those prohibitions. And you'll get some that say, like, Ibn Hazm, وَنَغَمَةَ الْعُودِ فِي الْأَحْيَانِ قَالُوا تَزِيرُ أَثَرَ الْأَحْزَانِ. That, like, the tunes of the oud every once in a while will remove depression and get rid of. So he says, وَجْزَمْ عَلَى التَّحْرِيمِ أَيْ جَزْمِ وَالْحَزْمُ أَلَّا تَتْبِعْ Ibn Hazmi. But consider them not permissible and don't follow Ibn Hazm. فَقَدْ أُبِيحَتْ عَنْدُهُ الْأَوْتَارُ وَالْعُودُ وَالطَّنْبُورُ وَالْمِزْمَارُ, because he permitted all these musical instruments. The Andalusians, like I said, tended to permit that. And my personal belief is that in European and Western Islam generally, that Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayez said, do not bring an Islam with that prohibition as introducing people to Islam. Let people come into Islam with their instruments and all these things, and then wean people off diversion and wasting their time, because Islam is a religion where time is very precious, and those types of things are really diversionary things. Right? So anyway, I spent a little more time than, but I wanted to just cover that. So go ahead, next one.
وللجدال تعتري الأحكام يحرم إن يقصد به الإفحام لجلبه غوائل الملاهي كالعجب والحقد وحب الجاه وقد رأى بعض ذوي البصائر الإثاء إن يكثر من الصغائر. As for debates and dialectics, they fall under the 5 rulings and are prohibited if silencing one's opponent is what is intended. The reason for this is that it engenders destructive matters that have been prohibited, such as contempt, envy, vanity, and love of position in the hearts of men. Indeed, some scholars of penetrating insight have even reckoned recurring disputation to be among the venial sins.
Okay, so basically what he's saying is jidal, which is argumentation. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Ma ضل قوم بعد هدى كانوا عليه إلا أوتوا الجدل." That people never go astray after they had guidance, except it's replaced with argumentation. That's actually a quality of people that are astray. They start arguing about everything and they can't agree on anything. And that's why if you know certain qawaid fiqhiyya, like one of them is al-mukhtalaf fihi la yunkaru. If there's disagreement about something, you shouldn't get into arguments about it. The mujma' alayh is what we all agree on. So when you have differences of opinion, do we practice nus sha'ban or not? You can clarify what your position is, but don't attack people who take another position when it's a valid position. Do we celebrate the Mawlid or not? These are khilaf issues. And you can present your position, that's fine. Say, look, the Salaf didn't practice it, here's why we shouldn't practice it, but we recognize there's a khilaf here, and and show the two arguments, right? And then leave people alone. But to go and try to stop people from practicing things that are disagreed on, that leads to sectarianism, it leads to division, it leads to hatred, and it splits an ummah. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inna hadihi ummatukum ummatan wahida, wa ana rabbukum fattaqoon. Right? I'm your Lord. Don't forget who's your Lord. Shakespeare said, it is idolatry to make the service greater than the God. Sometimes Islam becomes what they're worshipping. All these rules. The Prophet ﷺ was very generous with people even when they broke the rules, he was very generous. The man who slept with his wife during Ramadan, just look at that hadith, how he dealt with him. The people that were new in Islam, he just told them, eat the meat and say Bismillah and eat the meat. Aisha said, why are you telling them that? Right? Because what you put in your mouth is so important. He said, they're new Muslims. Just leave them alone. This is hikmah, this is wisdom. But somebody becomes Muslim, they want them to be like Sahaba the next day, even though they're not like Sahaba. Right? But is this what they expect? No, let them come in with all their faults and blemishes. Right? So, what he's saying is that, and then Imam Malik radiallahu anhu said, مَا كَانَ الْجِدَالُ مِنَ الدِّينِ فِي شَيْءٍ. Argumentation has nothing to do with our religion. A man came to Imam Malik radiallahu anhu once and he said, Jadilni, I want to argue with you. And Imam Malik radiallahu anhu said, okay, so you beat me what? He said, you follow me. He said, and I beat you. He said, I follow you. He said, what if a third person comes and he beats both of us? He said, then we follow him. He said, you're going to be on a new religion every day. See you later. Right? People discovering, I found this new hadith. This stuff's all been worked out. You're not going to discover anything new. Right? You might find something out, but the Maliki school knew about it, the Hanafi school knew about it, the Shafi'i school, they all knew about it. They've been debating this stuff for centuries. Why are you reinventing the wheel? So that's, it's very dangerous, all of this argumentation, but they go under the 5 rulings, right? Ta'tari al-ahkam. It can be wajib, sometimes you have to argue, and the Nuh alayhi salam, their people complained that he was always arguing with them. He was trying to save them. So jidal can be to manifest the truth. It can be mandub, it can be mubah. Even they say that for students it's good to debate, but they have to know the rules of debating, because it sharpens their mind so that they can make arguments. Imam Shafi'i radiyallahu anhu said that he never got into a debate except he didn't care who won. Ma baraytu agharabani khasmi aw gharabtuhu. He said, I could care less whether I won the debate or the one I was debating with won the debate. For him, what was important was the truth manifested. That's somebody who doesn't have ego invested in the debate. But a lot of people don't. So, and then he says, because it brings all of these problems like hiqd and ujab. You get resentment, you get things. So, in the Babahth he said, حُكْمَ الْجِدَالِ تَابِعٌ لِقَصْدِ صَاحِبِهِ. It follows the intention of the one who wants to argue. فَإِنْ قَصَدَ التَّعَنُّتْ وَالْعِنَادِ. If they're just intent obstinacy and they want to just be fanatic about their position, وَخَاصَمَ فِي الْحَقِّ بَعْدَ ظُهُورِهِ, and they're still arguing against the truth after it's manifested, أو بباطل, or something false, أو غلب على ظنه أن خصمه لا ينفع الجدال معه أو كان فيما ليس تحته عمل فممنوع. It's prohibited in all those things if you're just arguing for the sake of argumentation. And Imam Malik radiallahu anhu said, Inna ahla biladina, meaning al-Madina, the great ulama of Medina, yakrahun al-jidal wal-bahth wal-nadhar. They didn't like any types of debates. Illa fima tahtuhu amal, duna ma sabiluhu al-i'tiqad. Unless it was a fiqh issue that they were trying to resolve. If it was about aqidah, they didn't like it. Don't debate aqidah. Aqidah is what it is. You get into debates about it, you'll end up saying something about God. وَأَن تَقُولُوا لَا مَا لَا تَعْلَمُ. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, إِنَّمَا حَرَّمَ الْفَوَاحِشَ إِنَّمَا حَرَّمَ رَبِّي الْفَوَاحِشَ مَا ظَهَرَ مِنْهَا وَمَا بَطَنَ وَالْإِثْمَ وَالْبَغْيَ بغير الحق وأن تشركوا بالله ما لم ينزل به سلطانا وأن تقولوا على الله ما لا تعلمون. To say about God what you don't know. That is the worst thing that you can do. It's worse than shirk. Ibn Qayyim says that he began by talking about itham because that's the least of things, right? And then baghi, and then shirk, and he ended with saying about God what you don't know. That's the worst thing you can do. So people should have fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's what he's saying. That if there's action or something like that, then it's a good thing. And then he says, when you read manfa'atan fahuwa ala, this isn't in your text. Ala hasabiha wa karihu mala wala. So if you want benefit, if he wants benefit, then it's permissible, but you have to look at what way cost-benefit analysis. But it's makruh if there's no benefit or harm. It's just makruh to do it because of the problems that it leads to. And then some of the people of inner sight. Basira is to the intellect what the eye is to the vision is to the eye. So basira is the thing that enables you to see things clearly intellectually. And so the ulama say that argumentation, if you do it a lot, it's considered a saghira. It becomes a saghira for you to be doing. It's sinful. And we know there are argumentative people. Everybody knows them. There's just people that they like to argue. And أبغض الرجال عند الله اللد الخصم. In the Sahih, the Prophet ﷺ said the people most odious to God are people that love to argue. Mula, right? And they argue just for the sake of argumentation. Allah hates those people. They're odious to Him. So if you have that personality, Safrawi is an argumentative personality. So if you're choleric by nature, you'll tend to incline towards argumentation. Sanguine and phlegmatic don't really like to argue generally. But the choleric is argumentative. And the ulama tend to be choleric by nature. So it's something students of knowledge have to be very careful about that, because it is part of the nature. And it can become like a real sickness of the heart. Next one.
اسمعه لصوته من يعلم بحبها سمعه محرم ورفع صوت من يخاف منها تلذذ عد وعد منها أيضا تشبه الرجال بالنساء في صوتهن أو سواه واعكسا. Also prohibited is one's enabling a woman to hear his voice if he knows that she desires to hear it. Scholars have also reckoned the elevation of a woman's voice to be among the prohibitions if pleasure being derived from it is feared. They also have considered as prohibited men imitating women with their voices or in any other area, and vice versa.
So this women tend to be more affected by sound, men are more affected by vision. So a woman will be she'll actually be aroused by sound, whereas the man is aroused by the vision. And so what he's saying is, if you know that there's a alaqa, this first degree of love is called alaqa with the Arabs. If that's there, then it becomes haram, because you can have an effect on them, and it's not good for them, it's not good for you. And then he's saying about also raising the voice of a woman who people will derive pleasure again. These things, I mean, we're in very mixed cultures in the West. So, but in traditional Muslim countries, there was much more separation, and these rules, if you try to apply these rules in the United States or in Canada or somewhere where you're from, it's not really going to fly. But it is prohibited to take pleasure. If you know you're getting pleasure, then it's haram, and that's very clear. In terms of voice, a woman is not supposed to speak in a seductive voice. In America, that's usually resolved because women they speak like men now, so it's not really a problem. But in traditional societies, you tend to find women had very soft voices. You'll still find this if you go to certain Arab countries and you hear the women talk. It sounds so different from, if you go to, for instance, Mauritania, the women, the way they speak is very feminine. There's a lot of femininity in their words. They know in social studies that women who enter into management will tend to lower the tone of their voice, because they get more respect with a less high voice. So you'll find in many Muslim countries, women actually speak with high-pitched voices. Whereas if you'll notice in the West, the tone of the women's voices are actually lower in terms of, because they know that they'll get more respect from the men if they speak in those lower tones. So generally, it's not permitted to speak in a seductive way. And a lot of these robotic voices that they use are like more feminine voices and things like that they use on these message machines and things like that. But that's basically what he's talking about. And then also men imitating women is prohibited, and women imitating men. The Prophet ﷺ actually cursed the mukhanathin. لَعَنَ اللَّهُ الْمُخَنَّثِينَ وَالْمُتَرَجِّلَاتِ. May Allah curse the effeminate man and the masculine women. Now, the scholars, the khuntha in Arabic is a hermaphrodite. The mukhannath is an effeminate person. So you have the khuntha has a special hukum. In fact, in Iran, the ulama permitted sex operations to change the sex of depending on the hormones. So they would actually and traditionally the Muslims were very enlightened about these things. They didn't have the types of approaches that you saw in the West. The Muslims recognized that there are biological differences, that generally you have a male and a female, but then you get people that have mixed male and female hormones. And this is just part of life on earth. So it's that category has fiqh rulings for them, and even subhanallah, Abdurrauf al-Munawi, who was a great scholar of hadith, in his commentary on that hadith, he says, if the person is effeminate by their nature, فَلَا لَوْمَ عَلَيْهِ, then they're not blamed for that. In other words, if it's part of their nature. But he said, if it's affected, then it's where the curse goes. But if it's part of their nature, he says, يَتَكَلَّفُ إِزَالَتُهُ. He should try his hardest to get rid of it. So the point is if you see somebody like that, and generally you can distinguish when it's affected and when it's not. In my own personal experience, I grew up in California, and in the Bay Area. So, you generally can tell when somebody is naturally effeminate or when there's takalluf. And what they used to call loose-wristed. I don't know what they call them anymore. It's probably not politically correct anymore. But, basically people like that, and you shouldn't make judgments about people either. If somebody, because I've seen heterosexual men that are effeminate. Even in the Muslim community, you will find there are heterosexual men that are effeminate by nature. And so those people just, leave them alone. Don't make fun of them. Don't make istihza. This is, it's just compassion for people. Sometimes they have more estrogen, more hormones, the oxytocin hormone and things like that. And then you have women that have high testosterone levels, so they tend to be more masculine. And you have, the Baba Hassan from in Saudi Arabia. What do they say for the tomboy? Baba Hassan or Hassan Baba or something. Somebody from Jeddah told me that. Because I asked him, do you have tomboy? He said, yeah. He told me what it was. In Syria, what do they say? Do you have tomboy? Huh? Yeah, Baba Hassan. Yeah, so tomboy is a phenomenon. There are girls that tend to, from early on, they can show these masculine qualities. The Prophet ﷺ is cursing people that do this on purpose. Mutarajjilat and the mukhannathin. Yatakhanathu. Right? Khunutha is being effeminate. So there's also women that have that. They'll tend to be more masculine, and it could be a natural thing. So you just have to be careful. These aren't blanket rules about people, and you have to be careful judging people. Because a lot of this is hormonal. It's not something that people can control. Go ahead, next one.
ولا يضاحكن امرأ معلما لهن إلا أن يكون محرما.
Go ahead.
أما تصغريت النساء إلى الفرح فظاهر الحطاب أنه لم يبح اسمعها بضربها بالأرجل تبرجا ووسوسة الخلاخل. Nor should women be mirthful with their male teacher unless he is a legal intimate, mahram. As for women's تصغريت, for joyous expression, it would appear that according to Al-Hattab it is not permissible. Prohibited also is a woman's causing the subtle sound of her bangles to be heard by striking her feet as a way of calling attention to herself.
Right. So, if you're studying, because very often teachers were men, and so the women, to learn their fard ayn, they study with male teachers. Basically, it's prohibited for the women to be flirtatious. I mean, that's pretty much what it's saying. Don't be flirtatious. Sometimes women and men will develop, amorous feelings towards teachers and things. That happens, and that's where, they have to stop. They shouldn't be studying with somebody if they're going to have problems like that. But certainly they shouldn't be flirtatious with them, and unless they're mahram, they're not flirtatious, but then they can laugh with them or something like that. And then he says, tazagrit is where they move the tongue very rapidly back and forth. They usually cover their tongues, the women, and they do it in festivals and parties and at weddings and things like that. He's saying that, Al-Hattab, one of the great scholars of the Maliki tradition, his family from Libya originally, and there's three of them, the grandfather, the father, and then the son. And so one of them's from Libya, and the other two went to Mecca. But the Al-Hattab is one of the foundational later Malikis. His books are used. So he didn't consider it permissible. That's a khilaf issue. Some of the ulama permitted it because they said it just doesn't turn men on or something like that. I mean, that's basically what they said. So it's not a problem because that was, their concern. And then he said, Isma'uha bi darbiha bil arjuli tabarrujan wa wasat al-khalakhili. And this is from Jahiliyyah, the women used to, when the men would walk by, they would make the bangles sound, so to attract the man's attention. And so that was prohibited. Tabarruj in Arabic is prohibited. وَلَا تَبَرُّجْ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ الْأُولَى. Don't do the tabarruj, which is to display your ornaments. And tabarruj comes from a word baraja, means to, like baraza. It's related to baraza, in fact. It means to, the burj is a tower because everybody can see it. So tabarruj is when a woman does things to make everybody look at her. She becomes like a tower. And so that's what's prohibited, doing that. And then the sounds of the khalakhil, which are the bangles that she wears. وَهَكَذَا مِنْ سَيِّئَاتِ الْأَلْسِنَةِ تَغَزُّرًا بِامْرَأَةٍ مُعَيَّنَةٍ. Also, it's prohibited, and from the sins of the tongue, is to write love poetry to a specific woman who you're not married to. You can write love poetry to your wife. It's a good thing to do. She can write love poetry to you. But if it's a woman that you haven't married and you're writing her love poetry, it's haram. But they say that it's permissible to write love poetry if it's not a specific woman. So good luck with that. Yeah. So, وَلَا يَجُوزُ لَعْنُ شَخْصٍ عُيِّنَ. Go ahead. I just want to get through this one section. Go ahead.
ولا يجوز لعن شخص عينا وجاز لعن الجنس عند الفطناء. It is also prohibited to damn anyone by name, but the sagacious scholars have permitted damning evil types collectively.
So the reason for that is you don't know somebody's end, and so you should not say لعنه Allah or لعن Allah fulan. If they're a Muslim, you should never do that. But even for the non-Muslim, you don't know their end. For people that their end is known, Abu Jahl, Abu Lahab, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cursed them in the Quran. Tabbat yada Abi Lahab. So, but people you don't know their end, you shouldn't do a curse of them. They say, you can make dua against an oppressor who's oppressing you. But again, this is a difference of opinion. I wrote a whole article on this in the Prayer of the Oppressed about this problem. And the ulama differed on that, but Imam al-Ghazali tended not, حتى دعاء الظالم كلا صحح الله جسمه ولا سلمه, saying things like, may God not give him good health or something like that. At the same time, asking for the good health of an oppressor is prohibited. But generally, they permit that you can make dua against an oppressor if they're oppressing you. So like for Palestinians, they can certainly make dua against an oppressor that's oppressing them, or whoever it is. It's permissible to do that. It's always better to ask for people's guidance, and that's the gist of that argument. But anyway, وَالْإِنْتِسَابُ لِسِوَى أَبِيهِ مِنْهَا وَشَدَّدَ الْحَدِيثُ فِيهِ. Claiming to be from other than your father is haram. And the hadith says basically you don't go to paradise. So من ادعى إلى غير أبيه, right? لا يدخل الجنة. So just to say that you're something else, or to claim sharaf. الناس مصدقون في أنسابهم إلا لمن ادعى الشرف. People are believed about their ansab unless they claim to be from the Prophet's family. That needs tathabbut. People shouldn't make that claim because there's حقوق تترتب على هذا الشيء. There's rights that go with the family of the Prophet. And so that's a little different. And then he says, تبرؤ الإنسان من قرابتي كالابن والأخي ومولى نعمتي. You cannot relinquish your relationship with relatives and say, he's not my son, he's not my daughter, or a brother. And then the mawla also, which that doesn't apply anymore because there aren't people that go under that category, but that was a category. وَدْخُلْهُ فِي كَرَهَةِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَمِنْ يَقُونَانِ لِلْأَذْكِيَاءِ. So also there's a difference of opinion about not using euphemisms. Some of the ulama say anything that is language that is inappropriate for what you would call genteel company, that you should not use. So the Prophet never used language that was, like for instance, in this culture, not here, Turkey, but I don't know what they do here, but in the West, people say really crude things. Like when they're going to the bathroom, they say, it's just a crude language. And you should never use that language. You don't go, I'm going to urinate. They use other words for those things, but to say that, I need to go urinate or something like that, it's just inappropriate language. So you just say, I need to use the restroom. These are, euphemisms that are used in cultures because the Prophet ﷺ said that مَا كَانَ الْمُؤْمِنُ فَاحِشًا بَذِيًّا. A mu'min is not somebody who uses foul language or language that is devoid of decorum. So that's really important. Although there's a khilaf about it, he's just pointing that out, that if it's not swearing, because swearing generally is prohibited. Although we know that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu did once use a swear word when he got very angry at one of the Quraysh, and he said something really, it's quite shocking when you read it. First time I read it, I couldn't believe it. But that happens. Even the best of people can use a foul word if they get angry. And so that does happen. But the Prophet ﷺ said that it is not a habit of believers to use foul language. And so if you're using foul language habitually, check your iman, because something's wrong. So that's what he's basically arguing. The Prophet once used a very direct term about relationship between a man and woman, and because he asked him first using euphemisms, because the man was admitting to adultery, and then he asked him first in euphemisms, but then he said something really, really just as stark and candid as you can get in Arabic. And the ulama say that if you need to ascertain, then you have to use literal language. And so that is permissible to get that ruling. But other than that, you should not use words that directly indicate a thing that is inappropriate in company. And the Prophet ﷺ, in their company, they never talked about sexual things, any of these things, never. The Prophet ﷺ, they had a lot of comportment, decorum. It was very important in that community, and the Prophet ﷺ, that's his way. And the Prophet cursed people that talk to other people about things that go on behind closed doors with their own. He cursed that. So that's also completely private between people. وهاكما محقق الملاح قد حكموا به على التمساح. So maybe we should stop there, I guess. I'm not getting, how are we doing? Inshallah, get through it. I hope so. The music one was important, so I just want to make clear, it wasn't a blanket either or. I was just trying to clarify the nuances in that issue. And so is there a problem with the child learning to play musical instruments? Again, that's in the West. They're going to be exposed to music, and it just depends on certain situations and cultures that people are from. It's much better for them to be exposed to classical and appreciate those things than a lot of the common music that's out there. So, I would leave that to the families and the type families they're from. For Western people, certainly that was traditionally part of education, especially if they were from a cultured family. That was just part of being in a cultured family in the West. In the Muslim world, it's tend to be generally frowned upon to learn musical instruments for children. Children are very musical by nature, and in like Moroccan culture, the duf drum, even in Syrian culture, the duf drum is very common. A lot of people can play duf drum. If you're from Syria, it's something a lot of the kids learn early on. And even the ulama, some of the ulama can play the duf. And I know a few ulama that can play the duf. In Morocco, some of the ulama were notable musicians as well. And in the early period of Islam, there were some ulama that were notable musicians. So these are khilaf issues. I would leave it to the families. If you're obviously from a Deobandi background, or from certain backgrounds where these things that they take, most of the Deobandi positions are very strong about musical instruments, and we have to honor that and respect that, And if that's the background that you're from, then that's certainly the more cautious position. إن الحلال بين وإن الحرام بين وبينهما أمور مشتبهات. Musicality goes under the mushtabihat, undeniably. So, but to say it's clearly haram or it's clearly halal, it doesn't fly. Both positions, neither of them fly. But it's definitely mushtabihat, undeniably. So, the Prophet ﷺ said, if you want to protect your religion, it's better to avoid the mushtabihat. But certainly sama' and ghina, like what we heard now, this is permitted. And for people to say that it's haram, hatu burhanakum in kuntum sadiqeen, bring your proofs, because it's a very hard thing. So how would you help fellow Muslims move away from music and intoxicants? Well, if they're in intoxicants, Imam Sidi al-Mawaq says that you should teach them a musical instrument to get them out of intoxicants. Because he said that intoxicants are very similar, they have a similar effect that musical instruments have, because the dopamine's released. People get high playing musical instruments. I mean, musicians know this. Anybody who's played an instrument at any serious level knows that it can be very intoxicating to play a musical instrument. So that's what Sidi Mawaq, because he said you're getting them out of something that's agreed upon in its prohibition and moving them into something that at least there's a difference of opinion, and it will give them the same type of experience. Isn't a woman's voice awra? There's a khilaf about that, but the position of Muhammad al-Hassan is that it's not awra. And certainly the early, I think the position that it's not awra is far more convincing than the position that it is awra. Allah says, لا تخضعن بالقول, don't. Just the fact that they were told not to be seductive in their voices meant that it was permissible for them to talk. But the idea that a woman can't speak in public, the hadith of Umar, which is after the Prophet ﷺ, where the woman got up and told him, why are you saying that to not give us our dowries, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows a qintar, which is a very large amount of money. And Umar, when she said that, he said, أصابت المرأة وأخطأ عمر كلكم أفقه من عمر. The woman's right and Umar's wrong, and all of you are more knowledgeable than Umar. So he didn't say أعوذ بالله صوتك عورة اسكتي. He didn't say that. She could have sent something up, a piece of paper or something, right? So, but I think in certain environments, and this also goes under urf. Really, I respect urf a lot. Urf is our word for culture. The Europeans didn't have a word for culture until I think the late 18th century or the early 19th. So they didn't even know about culture. Muslims knew about culture. A'raf is part of Islam. Al-urf, al-'ada muhakkama. The norms of a people have legal rulings. And so culture is respected, and people's culture should be respected. Different peoples do different things. If I go to the Eastern Province, I have friends there in Arabia. I've never seen their wives. And they're close friends. But I've never seen their wives, because that's their culture. the women are in complete seclusion. And if they come out, they wear from black from head to toe. That's their I respect that. That's their culture. If you go to Yemeni culture, that's also generally the way it is. If you go to any tribal cultures where marriage is a very tricky thing, they tend not, because they don't want clans mixing and doing things like that, so they tend to have those seclusions. And Europe was certainly like that to a certain degree. So, you know, in other cultures, it's not like that. If you go to other cultures, there's a more relaxed atmosphere about that. And Syria, you'll see different types. Some families are very conservative, and it's very separate, and then other families are less so. So that also can be different families, and that's generally more religious than cultural, because they're taking religious positions that are more conservative. So the urf, they're taking the religious position, which might be overriding the urf, or it's an earlier, because araf change, cultures change. And we're certainly seeing a liberalization of Islam. I mean, you know, may these blessed souls all, you know, be happy that we're using their extraordinary techie that they've developed. But in their time, a woman would not be sitting in this floor next to the men. It just wouldn't happen. She'd be up there with that little masharabiyya looking through one of the holes, right? And that's the way it was, right? And that's certainly the way it is still in certain places. We were somewhere last night where the women were up and they were looking through the mashrabiyas. I mean, I know because my wife was up there and she told me, you know, because I said, did you? She said, we had to look through little holes. And that's pretty much the way. This was a very segregated culture. So these are a'raf. Different cultures have different approaches. But it's important that we maintain, you know, in Islam there are mutaghayyirat and thawabit. There are things that change, and then there are fixed things. The things that you can never change is khalwa. You cannot be alone. Indiscriminate mixing, where there's not decorum and comportment. You should not have unmarried people simply mixing, or unmarried with married people. This is how you get a complete disintegration of a culture, like you have in the West, where they've broken down. Marriage is broken down. Everything's broken down. So there are definite things that we should guard. Modesty in dress, modesty in speech, comportment. I mean, people now dress, it's amazing. Like these people dress was, even peasants in the Muslim world dressed with great dignity. They would never go out in T-shirts because T-shirts were underwear. I mean, in my culture, you know, when I was a kid, that was when it all started changing. You know, Marlon Brando wore a T-shirt on a film, and then everybody started wearing T-shirts. Before that, if you went out with a T-shirt, people would have been shocked because it's underwear. Okay, what's he doing with his underwear on? But now T-shirt has become national dress in America. You know, have a nice day. You know, or billboards, you know, like wearing billboards, free advertising for corporations. You know, Nike. You know, you're just a product placement. In weddings, we have music played, even separated ones. What is the replacement to it? You know, music is permissible in weddings. Again, stringed instruments, bands, that's where you're going to get the khilafat. But the idea of entertainment at a wedding, that's in the sound hadith, and the Prophet ﷺ permitted it. So I'm just saying, you know, there's differences of opinion about these things, and you should follow, you know, if you want the dominant opinion, to ask the mufti that you trust, and if he gives you the dominant opinion, it's best to follow the dominant opinion in a madhab. You know, and some would argue that it's, you know, wajib. I mean, that's certainly where the later fuqaha came to, of following the dominant opinion. The dominant opinion tends to be very conservative on the issue of music. So, سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. جزاكم الله خيرا.
السلام عليكم. So tomorrow's schedule is as has been passed out already on the sheets with no changes. Just a quick comment about the use of the chairs along the back, to please give priority to those who are more experienced in life, and those who have less experience can maybe join us on the floor, inshallah. Otherwise, we'll make adhan for Isha. So, Assalamu alaikum.